Welcome back to Season 2 of the Spiritable podcast. My name is Luke.
I'm Richard. I'm getting a master's in divinity. On this show, we try to bring spiritual ideas down to earth.
We're all trying to be better people and grow, so get on board. All right, 3, 2. Welcome back to the Spiritable podcast. I'm Luke.
I'm Richard.
And today we have on our friend Dr. Aram Yardumian, who is a professor of anthropology. What else do you teach at the college?
Well, everything relates to anthropology, but there are some courses that have the history prefix, I think. But that's about it.
Nice.
Everything relates to anthropology.
Yeah. Aram, you've also published a number of scholarly articles and that kind of thing. Any particular areas of expertise you want to introduce yourself for?
Well, my professional training began actually in archaeology and ended in molecular anthropology. So the way I see it is I bring those two things together and use those methodologies in tandem to study the ancient world.
Look at that. Very concise. All right, well, we're going to get going here. We'd like to open it up with spiritual icebreakers. So I know, Richard, you haven't spoken much, but I wrote them down, so I'm going to power through here.
Yeah, go for it.
So first, Aram, question for you. Do aliens exist? And if so, does God love them more than us?
I believe that they do, but they may not exist in the same dimension as us, as we exist.
Okay.
So, you know, I think the question about whether God loving other aliens is almost a non-question, because I think that God's love is something that applies to every molecule equally.
Living or non-living?
Living or non-living. Maybe that's sort of like a Jane view of the universe, but I think it's valid.
Okay, nice. Can you go into a little bit what you mean by more dimensions or an other dimensional being?
Well, we as humans are constrained by what we can sense through, sight, sound, tactile sense, and to a lesser extent olfactory. We probably gained a lot more information in the evolutionary past through our olfactory sense, but now we rely mostly on sight. Mm-hmm. But outside of that, we have no idea what's going on right here. We have no idea what's going on because of the limitation of our five senses. So that's one way of looking at that. But of course, we live in a three-dimensional world, and there are fifth and sixth dimensions out there that we are unable to see because of the limitations of our bodily hardware. Yeah.
No. Yeah, that's great. I was going to say, quick side question from that is, maybe this is too big of a topic, but how do you think the way we've become ingrained with technology is going to change the way that humans evolve? Because I read a cool thing about maybe humans evolving more dexterous thumbs and bigger eyes to accommodate this new tech. Any thoughts on that?
Not really. I mean, you could make the same argument about shaving. I mean, we shave our faces and other parts of our bodies generation after generation, and the hair doesn't go away.
That's true.
So that's not really the way it works. Mostly this is mostly evolution in the sense that we're talking about. Genetically, epigenetically, is something that is caused by random mutations in gene flow. So, there are going to be people out there who are hairless, or maybe there are people with larger thumbs. And if those people happen to be more successful, then maybe,
Any predictions about what a human being is going to look like in 3,000 years?
3,000
years?
Yeah,
3,000. Let's super fast forward.
I'm a reader of Ray Kurzweil, and I think that certainly by 3,000 years, we won't even have bodies anymore. We won't be talking about humans, and really maybe nobody will be talking at all. Maybe language won't even be a thing.
What? That's crazy.
Yeah, sure. Life will be largely, in 3,000 years, I think computing power will have allowed life in whatever form it exists to be non-dimensional. So we'll be able to, we'll basically be digital beings. We may have no dimensions. Life may have no dimensions at all. And I guess there's a semantic argument that you could apply now, which would suggest that life doesn't have a dimension even now.
Yeah, well, I guess I hear what you're saying, because in the New Church belief, we are at the end of the day, our souls, not our bodies. So what really is our life and our eternal life is our souls, not these things that we are housed in. So that's fascinating. Richard, any thoughts?
I might be a little skeptical, and not skeptical because of the ability of science necessarily 3,000 years in the future, but the choice of humanity
To give up a body?
Yeah, I feel like people are pretty generally.
Are you telling me that if you had a choice to be in your body or to have an experiment, and you could come back to your body, but to leave your body behind and go experience what consciousness within a digital realm would be like, you wouldn't jump on that?
Oh, well, I'd try for sure, but I think I'd come back to my body because, I enjoy my senses, and I think it's ingrained in humanity to enjoy the senses.
Maybe we won't in 3,000 years.
I don't know.
I like it.
Well,
I'm gonna think about that more. What were you saying, Aram?
That it won't suddenly be a choice. It's going to be a gradual and slow process, beginning with mind downloading. I mean, these are all things that I'm, this is just stuff that's coming from reading Ray Kurzweil. You'll begin with mind downloading, and gradually computing power will get smaller and the physical hardware of computing will get smaller and smaller. It'll a physical limit as to how small it can be, and then it will begin expanding to something the size of the Death Star. And by that time, computing power will be unlimited. So the choice may not be yours to make.
Oof. 1984, anyone? Question mark. I only made it halfway through that book, by the way. I thought it was
3,000.
3,084. All right, next question. We're going in a different direction. What, if anything, would you say is your most extreme belief? You can think about that one for a second, too. Most extreme belief.
I'll tell you what, guys. Let me think about that, and we'll come back to that one. Maybe edit something in.
That sounds
great. Sure that I could come up with something to say, but
sure.
Sounds
no,
good.
yeah, I'd definitely be curious to hear more thoughts on that. But part of the fun of these icebreakers is just kind of throwing these big questions at people and seeing how you deal with it. But definitely think about that and come back to us. Okay, next question, and then we'll move on to Richard talking about stuff of the week, so we can get you in here. I've actually asked all of our guests this because I think it's a fun way of bringing, again, like what we do on this podcast is bringing spirituality down to earth to see how religious experience has actually affected someone's day-to-day life. So if you have anything that stands out to you, I'm curious to know what your best and worst spiritual experience has been in your life. Like I can think back to when I was little, and I felt like I had a more direct connection to God, just like sitting beside my father in church, hearing people sing around me, which is like a very like moving thing for me as a small child. And I had a really bad experience being in sort of an evangelical youth group and feeling pressured into admitting that I hadn't asked Jesus to save my soul. And it was just a horrible time where I pressured into it. So I'm curious if anything in your past has stood out to you.
Yeah, well, I had a sort of a similar experience. I've always been interested in the way other communities function and the way they live. And yeah, so I was living in the Fort Lauderdale area decades ago, and a girl picked me up at the gym. And little did I know that the date we were going to go on was actually to an evangelical church.
No way.
What a wild first date.
Yeah. If I can only remember her name now. But this is, so this is in the 90s. So of course she takes me to this revival, somewhere outside of Fort Lauderdale. I really don't know where. And I just felt like, I felt sort of an emptiness there, a spiritual emptiness, like a lot of people were lost. But I also had to remember that, I had to place myself as a sort of a separate category of person who hadn't chosen to buy what was going on in there.
Right.
But it was later, I think, that I realized why I felt a great sense of emptiness there. I was watching actually a documentary about the experience of schizophrenics who had recovered from their experience of illness. And one of them said that during their heightened sort of sense of heightened awareness from schizophrenia, that they specifically went to religious revivals, and because it made them feel normal. So people were, the activity that they saw, the social interaction of people, engaging in a kind of a mind, almost a loss of the rational mind, made them feel, observing the situation, that they could anchor themselves in a reality. So what I came back to, putting my two experiences together, was that maybe what I felt there wasn't something that was so empty, but just something that I couldn't empathize with.
Right.
But a good spiritual experience would be one, thinking back to even further in the past. I was lying in bed one night on a sugarcane farm outside Durban in South Africa, and there was someone else sleeping in the room, and there was a light at the end of the room out in the hallway, and I felt someone in the middle of the night, close to my body.
Right.
And I assumed it was someone just checking on me, so I didn't react. But I sat up a little bit, and whoever it was, I saw emerge from the darkness and turn the corner into the hallway, and it wasn't someone I knew. It looked like someone, in South Africa, of course, you're very aware of who's white, who's black, and so on. It wasn't really a person that had any distinct ethnicity, but I noticed that they had a lot of things hanging from their body.
What do you mean by things?
I could remember. And in the morning, so I got up and I looked out in the hall, and I saw the same person turning the corner into a room, that would be, the room from which you would exit the house. Right. So I just went back to bed, no big deal. In the morning, I heard a shotgun go off. And I asked the owner of the farm when I saw him, what was the shotgun blast about? And they said, oh, well, we had to put a horse down. Why'd you have to put a horse down? Well, because there was a witch doctor here last night.
No! What? How is that a good spiritual experience? I'm freaking out over here, man. What?
Well, you can't figure out why that's a good spiritual experience? I mean, sure.
Because he didn't kill you? I don't know. Really? Oh my gosh. That's horrifying. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but it's something that's, that affected me for forever. Well, so, that experience, I wasn't scared and I wasn't horrified in the moment, but it certainly opened up doors that are, in my mind, still open. So
how so? What did it open for you?
Well, I don't know that there was actually a witch doctor in my room physically. It's quite possible that it was a spirit there.
Yeah.
Looking at, because I would have been the only one on the farm that he didn't recognize.
Right. Oh. So that morning, had the witch doctor done something to the horse, or why did they kill the horse?
Well, because the witch doctor had come in search of horse intestines.
Oh.
So he reached up, so to speak,
sure, and
sliced everything out. Oh. And so they put the horse down.
Oh, rough. Cool. Well, Aram, thank you for opening up and sharing that stuff with us. I'm definitely gonna remember that story. That was fascinating.
Yeah. Well, should we head into some review of the week? Let's do it.
Let's talk about what's been going on.
I was reading an interesting study that was done in this past week about the effect of religious communities on the current epidemic situation. And it was really fascinating. The study was saying, it was a study of just the United States, and some polls that were done show that almost 120 million Americans attend religious services at least once a week, which is a massive amount of Americans. and over 50% of Americans are involved in some religious affiliation.
That seems really high to me.
Yeah, I mean, but I think it was a Gallup poll. So,
Okay.
and so this study was talking about the effect of in religious communities, how the religious leaders handle the announcement about coronavirus and how the spread of coronavirus happens in those communities. And it's apparently super drastic. I know just some stuff I heard from my brother. Wow, my brain is not working today. I'm so sorry. My brother lives in the Bronx in New York City, and he was talking about just nearby. There's a Jewish community, and the leader of that community at the beginning of this outbreak basically said we're not letting this stop our services. We're still going to hold services and gather as a community, and it spread drastically through the community.
Wonder why.
And there's I was reading a story about a bishop in Virginia who said, God is greater than coronavirus, and he's recently passed of coronavirus. And big pastors saying, this is testing us.
Right.
The only way you get it is if you don't trust that God will keep you from getting it. We have the power to heal others. So go out and lay your hands on those with the virus and you'll heal them if you believe, all this sort of stuff. And it gives religious communities a bad name. But then again, there also, this study went into a lot of religious communities immediately were like, this is a big deal. We need to put the value of human life above everything else.
Right.
There are ways that we can gather. There are ways that we can give to our community that don't put people at risk. And the study went on and talked about how people of religious belief are often likely to follow their religious leader, right? They're likely to listen to what their pastor says, and sometimes with a growing skepticism of our political framework, people are much more likely to listen to their religious leader than to their political leaders because they just automatically assume, oh, well, he has some ulterior motive. This is a political thing. There's something to be gained. But when your religious leader says, like, no, this is to save human life,
it's hard to say no to that.
It becomes more transparent that it is a humanitarian thing.
Yeah.
So I just thought it was really interesting to see such an obvious positive and negative effect that religious community has on the area around it. And we've talked a little bit on like the best and worsts of religious community and what they do for culture and the world. And I just thought it was really fascinating to see, such a blatant example of that. Yeah. How when a community is trying to help people with what they think is true and they are right, it can be so beneficial or it can be so destructive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's sort of unfortunate that the ministers who, in my opinion, are doing the wrong thing and telling people to still come to church to go and heal other people, which is ridiculous and cannot happen now, that is what's getting portrayed in the media. And people are like crying out against Christianity in general because of these things. The most extreme and the worst people being sort of represented or representative of the rest of religion gives it a bad rep, and that's too bad. But it's frustrating because, like, at the same time, it's their fault that that's happening. Like, they need to change in order for that reputation to change, because that's going to stick around because they're still being the worst. So, like, I get it.
An interesting question from this is how those in religious communities that believe that are trying to better the world and have such a bad rap, how they respond in ways right now that show people that they care. And I mean, that applies to any sort of community overall. But I think that when all that's portrayed is the negative of something and the positive is saying everyone stay at home, like we're not going to gather, we're not going to do big events. So it's like the only place where communication is happening is with the people who are doing destructive behavior. And the constructive behavior is to basically be dormant for a while. So it puts religious community in a really tough situation. And I guess the thing I wanted to come to with this is we see in these religious communities that are basically ignoring the stay-at-home orders and stuff like that, freedom of religion resulting in a real destructive death toll.
Yeah,
in our
like
country.
A very tangible result of their
very
actions.
obviously, the fact that freedom of religion protects people defends people in doing a destructive behavior. People have died as a result.
Well, let me just jump in and offer a perspective on this. I don't know that the common denominator here is really religion, because after all, there are millions of religious adherents who are staying at home. Mm-hmm. The common denominator here may, in fact, be
dumb people.
Something that we should actually think back to Emerson about to understand in that sense, in the sense that, Emerson outlined the idea that there was an individualist aspect to America that made it distinct from other nations and cultures. And this, I see the anti-science, anti-government, and sovereign citizen movement as being sort of a latter day iteration of this individualism. I'm not going to go as far as to say it's individualism gone wrong, but it's individualism in its nth generation. So individualism in the sense is that we can't trust the government to tell us anything factual. We can't trust science to tell us anything factual. We can only trust ourselves. And by ourselves, I mean our small community of religious believers.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also a tactic that religious communities use to strengthen the faith that the people are in and sort of the manipulation that people can be in. Like, I forget what site it was, so I can't get the proper source, but I was reading an article about the Mormon church and how their practice of going around and evangelizing door to door, knocking, have you heard the good book? That whole spiel is designed to strengthen their faith and their religion, because if you are so strongly putting forth what you believe and getting rejected to your face so many times, and then you're coming back and sharing your rejection with these other core people who believe the same thing as you do, that's just ingraining that faith within yourselves because of the opposition that you've been met with from the outside world. So with these religions saying, of course the WHO doesn't want you to go and see people. They don't want people to be healed. They're profiting from the deaths of all these people. It's hard to break out of that manipulative cycle, even more, especially in this time when people are prevented or slowed from communicating with each other. So yeah, I do see it as this sort of evolved individualism, almost tribalism sort of thing.
And I think that's where individualism inevitably leads. I think that people can kind of see individualism and think that it leads to anarchy, basically, at its extreme. But I don't think that's really true, because I think that any void is going to, any power vacuum is going to be filled. And I think inevitably it just becomes this sort of really exclusive us versus them tribalism type mentality, where it's almost their ideas are wrong because they're the ones who believe it. So anything the government tells us is wrong because it's the government saying it, or anything that other faith believes is wrong because it's their belief. And it's explicitly a kind of counter belief, which is a belief that has very little real substance in my mind if it's just based off of not what they think, you know?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. On a similar note, I mean, it's hard not to talk about the consequences of the pandemic going on, but I just want to hit some quick economic facts or some projections that are coming out of the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. It recently said that we're in the worst economic recession since the Great Depression, which, I mean, is fairly obvious from looking at it. But they're saying over 2020, there's going to be a negative 3% global decline. And then in the next 2 years, it's projected like a $9 trillion loss to GDPs globally, which is just an unfathomable amount of money, like just a number you cannot comprehend. And so I've been thinking about this a little bit, especially with a lot of my friends and family who are unemployed or on unemployment benefits, and sort of the relationship between money and spirituality. Like, I think there is a certain threshold of survival that people need to meet in order to be able to focus on their spiritual journey in a more significant way. Because when you're just focused on where am I going to find my next piece of food, it's hard to think about God and all of that, or think about how you can improve as a person when you're literally starving. So I'm wondering, for Aram, like as you look back through history, how do you see, in your expertise, the relationship between economic funds and spirituality among groups of people? Has that ever come up in any of your studies or any of your thoughts?
Well, I mean, aside from the obvious, which is to say, new world religions and cults that that demand money and fetishize it, I can't think of a historical way of looking at the fetishization of money, but
yeah,
you could say, I suppose, that the economy and religion have always had a relationship, in the sense that in the Paleolithic, we're not talking about currency, but we're talking about hunting, and hunting magic and religion are inextricable at this time. And in the Neolithic, economy depended on agriculture, and agriculture in turn depended upon the natural environment. So religion at that point took on the guise of an anthropomorphic relationship between humans and non-human actors, which were given human characteristics so that they could possibly respond through appeasements and sacrifices and other form of magical behavior.
Does that all relate back to kind of just God providing in general? Like when we look to God to provide, like actually giving manna to people in the Bible versus allowing people to hunt successfully?
Sure, it's all a form of appeasement. It's all a form of what you would call petitionary rituals, because after all, you don't always get everything you ask for in prayer, right? In fact, you rarely do.
Yeah.
But sometimes there's a coincidence involved. If you pray to the river god and ask for a flood for agricultural reasons, and it happens, you're going to associate the two things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I wonder if it gets, I don't know if this is even a good thought or not, but I wonder if it gets more difficult to have that relationship with God when provision becomes so standardized and top-down hierarchical from a political governance. Like when someone like hands me a paycheck, maybe that's harder for me to connect to God rather than going out and hunting and killing something and feeling like, okay, God put that deer in my path so that I could feed my family. Like it feels like a level removed from a spiritual process of provision.
Yeah, well, I think that gets back to, I think what you said earlier about when people are in extreme need, it's harder for them to work on spiritual process. Mm-hmm. I think there's something to that, but I also think people in extreme need are often more religious from a place of kind of desperation
yeah.
Often. And I also think just within a single person's life, like I definitely am a more religious person in extreme need, like in my extreme need spiritually. I think it is, and I think we see this
but I think that's
culturally right now. Like I was just talking to another pastor, and he said his his online congregation is twice the size that he ever had coming on Sunday.
Right.
And I think part of that might be ease of online access, but they were live streaming the whole time anyway, so they could have been tuning in online before this. And so I think a big part of it is people looking for help and answers and comfort when things are really dire.
To push back a little bit, like I do think that's true and people do that. And I don't want to say that one person's belief is not as good as another's, but that's what I'm about to do, basically. Like someone in desperation crying out, "Oh God, please save me," in my belief isn't as real as isn't as progressive spiritually as someone looking at the evil in their life and staying away from it.
I agree, but I think both of those happen in a single individual.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like hopefully that same person that is working actively. I guess the point that I'm getting to is your thing about like when I just go and get my paycheck and I'm generally living pretty good. It's easier to kind of forget religious life.
Yeah.
And I think that there's validity to that because just naturally, I think people turn to spirituality for help. And when you don't feel like you need help, you don't turn to it.
Right. But I just don't want to look at it as like, oh, look how much more, how much the increase of spirituality with people in this pandemic, to me, feels like a short-lived, almost, I don't want to say fake, but like, is that going to last beyond if everything was normal, those people might not be like, I don't want to hate on the people who are praying. Obviously, like that's great. I just want it to be from a real place, not just a desperation and then have that flee away when everything's fine.
Well, I think that desperation is a real place for sure. And I think that it leads an opportunity if religious communities do a good job at comforting people and helping people through these times.
Yeah.
And people feel connected with God. Then that is an opportunity for people to get more in touch with their faith. But I do think that a lot of people, once things are back to normal, will get back to how they wanted to live their lives previously. And yeah, I think there will be a movement back away for a lot of people. And that's just kind of how it
Richard,
is.
away was actually my keyword that you've triggered for my segment of the day, which is to quiz your ass. What is the shortest psalm in the Bible? You have to answer this correctly or else you cannot graduate theological school. Aram, if you know, you get the master's in divinity.
I don't know.
The shortest psalm
I know the
in the
shortest
Bible.
passage in the Bible, but I'm not sure.
Jesus wept. Amen.
Yeah.
Come on, Richard. Dig deep. There are only like 205 to pick from or something.
150.
Oh, you know that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or 151, depending on if you are that
Shortest
faith
psalm.
Christian
Let's
or not.
go.
I don't know. I think it's in. Wow.
Richard failed the segment. It is Psalm 117, Richard.
117.
Which reads, "Praise the Lord, all you nations. Extol him, all you peoples. For great is his love towards us, and the faithfulness of the Lord endures forever."
Yeah.
Psalm 117, you can't graduate.
I'm embarrassingly unfamiliar with the Psalms.
Aram, do you have a
TBH.
favorite Bible passage? Any favorite story on your part?
No.
Cool, moving on.
I'll back up Richard's point by saying that it isn't, or actually by asking you guys a question, hasn't it always been, as long as there's been a middle class, the luxury of the middle class to not have to believe in anything?
So
Yeah.
non-belief as a luxury?
Yeah, notice I'm not saying the upper class, but rather the middle class.
Yeah, why are you not including the upper class?
Right. Well, I mean, I was going to see if you guys could figure it out, but
Wait, hold on.
this-
Let me think.
Well, I think that the lower class has desperation, and so they seek something to believe. And I think the upper class are often leaders in belief systems.
Elitist.
Um,
Hierarchicalist.
I mean, if you look at like the history of Catholicism, the upper class were either high members of the Catholic Church or the royal family, which the Catholic Church said was ordained by God. So in a way, all of them were religious leaders. And so
and the ones that provide for a lot, like, CEOs who employ however many thousands of people. In the upper class, they're wealthy, they are providing for these people. So maybe the middle class falls in that line where they're not desperate, but they are contributing to society, but they aren't providing in the same way to have that level of like, kind of self-God identity or provision identity. So maybe they're falling into that sort of middle area.
I was thinking,
did we hit on anything?
Both the upper and the lower classes, or I should say neither the upper nor the lower classes have the luxury of being able to define evil for themselves. But the middle class has that luxury.
Can you expand on that?
Well, the upper class knows that there's a power in religion, and it's in their interest to make sure that evil is a standard operating procedure. The lower class, likewise, is, I guess, forced into the idea, or led into the idea, toward the idea that there is a single truth and a single evil, and it's in their interest to believe that so that something can be achieved. But the middle class has this interesting luxury of being able to, through, this is going to sound a little bit Marxist, but I guess through a sort of fetishization of capital. And after all, that's kind of what we're talking about here. Sure. Capital, at least since the Industrial Revolution, and of course that's what Marx and Engels were watching as they were unfold. They were writing in England, not in Germany or Russia. They were watching the Industrial Revolution unfold, and they were watching massive social transformations, and among them was the replacement of God with money.
Right.
And when you are in control of money, you are in control of morals. So you get to define what's good and evil.
So that's why it's in the higher classes' self-interest to keep those definitions rolling, so they're in control.
Yeah. So as far as the upper class goes, that was the point.
And we see that going back even further than the Industrial Revolution, like with the dominance of the Catholic Church throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, and the extreme wealth gathered by the Pope and things like that, and the gathering of indulgences off of people to buy their way into heaven. You see there the entire Protestant movement was basically against this salvation by works, which had become essentially salvation by payment.
Right.
That tracks back even further.
All right. So, Aram, I want to shift focus to you a little bit. So I was doing some research on some of the articles that you've written, basically just looking at, if I'm going to be honest, most of the headlines and a little bit of synopses of some of your area of study, because I didn't have time to read everything that you've ever done. What a terrible way of introing that.
Yeah. I didn't have enough time for your life work.
Interest to look in. No. So I noticed a bunch of the papers that you've published are studying genetic diversity among specifically people in Georgia, like in that region. What were some of the specific places? There was Savanelli and you say it?
Svanetti.
Yes. So areas in Georgia. So I'm curious.
You're
what?
So white right now,
dude. I'm gonna restart this whole. Ben's gonna have fun editing that one. So I'm curious, Aram, what piqued your interest in studying, one, genetic diversity, and two, that region specifically?
Well, I went to Georgia and the Caucasus originally as an archaeologist, and it gradually became obvious to me that the questions I was interested in researching weren't answerable through archaeology. The questions I was interested in were more related to human dispersals. And genetic diversity is a way of looking at human dispersals in the sense that all humans ultimately have a common ancestor, and genetically you can work through the mutations to determine how closely related two individuals are, and then through population genetics, meaning through statistics, you can gauge how closely related two populations are. So archaeology can't tell you that. Archaeology is a very valuable discipline, in the sense that but it takes a long time to gather data from archaeology. Season after season of sifting sand through a teaspoon, will after years result in a publication. Right. So genetics is this. Right now, anthropological genetics is experiencing a field day, or really a field decade, in the sense that not only did I land in it at a time, I caught the wave, right at the time when it was rising, and people were able to sort of stake out their own territory around the world, gather data through sampling of contemporary populations, but now also remarkably technology and methodology for sourcing for extracting usable DNA from ancient contexts has gotten to the point where it's reliable. So now that kind of comparison is possible. So again, I went to the Caucasus originally as an archaeologist, and it turned out that the questions that I was interested in were better answered. So I switched methods.
I'm curious, how big of an ego is there in this field of study? Like, is it? It's commonplace to figure out new things and adapt them, but does that take a little bit of time? Because are people protective of things that they discovered that are now have been rediscovered as not true in the same way, or does that roll over really easily? Do people hold on to that? Like, how does that all work out?
Yeah, and certainly, one strategy in academia is to hold on to your statements, no matter how easily falsifiable there are. And the other strategy is to simply be more malleable. In science, it turns out that once you've made a statement, you're rarely proven wrong. It's just that, like a fractal, there are more and more shifts that come from it. And, I actually can't think of an example of something that was at least in the 20th and 21st centuries that was arrived at through science that turned out to be wrong.
Well, if we shift it to the Bible, religious podcast, we'll get religious. So many things that, the New Church believes as allegory in the Bible, and even maybe things the New Church sees as historically literate and biblically accurate, have come at odds with scientific developments. Like, the ark and the flood has not been proven in time. Adam and Eve obviously have not been proven. So, like, in your experience as an archaeologist and an anthropologist, how have you come to terms, or have you seen that being at odds with biblical literalism and all that sort of thing?
Oh yeah, I entered the field already knowing that. It's not as if I had any shattered illusions. But what you learn along the way is that there are differences of opinions about what's considered, what's considered trustworthy and on what level. So as it turns out, I would say in terms of the, let's say, the late Iron Age and early Classical Age in the region between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean that we call either Israel or Palestine. Sure. If there was no biblical text, we would know nothing about that area.
Right.
And in fact, it wouldn't look that different from what was going on in Syria and in Iran, maybe even as far east as Iran, Arabian Peninsula, Egypt. We wouldn't know anything. So that gives us a couple of insights. First of all, that it's remarkable that we have this text. And what if we had texts from north, south, east, and west of the area? What if we had a similar corpus of texts from Anatolia?
Right.
So the second thing then is that that biblical archaeology and the Bible don't really corroborate one another. There's very little.
Yeah.
Archaeology can really never be used to prove. I'm constantly thinking whether I even want to use that word, but to theorize the Bible.
Right. Is that a harsh line between Old Testament and New Testament?
No. I mean, the New Testament's just the same. With the New Testament, you're at least in the realm of having other literature that corroborates. You have Josephus, right, and you have Roman records, but that's really about all you have. So, and in the Old Testament, it just gets so murky in the sense that you have other traditions that are similar. There are other flood traditions. There are other creation stories. And there are some very interesting similar things in Egyptian tradition, especially, but there's very little to tell you. There's very little other kinds of evidence that can corroborate the Old Testament or the New Testament.
But by lack of corroborate, you don't mean that it disagrees necessarily or disproves biblical accounts, but that it doesn't prove biblical accounts.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay.
I mean, the closest, you're never going to find, I don't think, evidence that supports that there was ever an Exodus. Right? We've barely gotten to the point where we can even acknowledge that there was a community called Israel. And we've barely gotten to the point where we could recognize that there was actually a ruler named David.
So for
none
you,
of it is archaeological.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So for you, sorry, Richard, did you have a question? I don't want to over.
Yeah, I was going to say it's so interesting. Leading up to this, I was looking into some archaeological and biblical stuff, and what I found was when you search for biblical archaeology, my just gut reaction was that all of the results I found and all of the research I did suffers from so much confirmation bias. That either people are looking to be like, well, maybe this possibly fits with what was happening in Gath in Numbers 23. So yes, that's definitely what was happening. Or on the other side, people that are trying to disprove are like, well, we didn't find anything here and there would have been evidence left. And sort of this lack of evidence proves lack of existence fallacy that people that are trying to disprove biblical accounts fall into. And so it just becomes such a minefield of strongly held belief apart from the evidence found was my experience.
It's especially salient now in what you might call the Zionist era, because both biblical archaeology and population genetics have been used in the service of supporting the notion that contemporary Jewry somehow belongs in this region. So anyway, that's another rabbit hole. But in terms of biblical archaeology for the rest of us, this has, the origins of this discipline are in questions of whether the Bible can be corroborated somehow, and it's almost impossible to divorce those two things. It's almost impossible to find anything over there without looking at it through the lens of the biblical text, and that's just how powerful that text is.
That's a cool framework to look at it from. One I've never really made the mental shift to do so, and that's kind of cool. I like it.
Yeah, and I mean anyone that is studying archaeology in that area would be foolish not to be familiar with the Bible, and whether they believed it as accurate or didn't would inevitably color their perception of what they find.
Well, Aram, do you want to real quick say who has the proper claim to Jerusalem at all? Did you want to quickly do that?
Oh, I really don't want to say that. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, oh man, do I even want it? No, I don't want to.
I think you made the right choice.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Well, and maybe this is too personal of a question, but for you, from your academic background, looking at the Bible, is there anything for you where you're like, okay, I think this did actually happen, or this, I definitely don't think this happened, or does that even matter?
Yeah, it doesn't matter to me. I mean, there are the factuality of that is I think irrelevant, because I don't think that anyone's faith or belief is dependent on the factuality of those accounts. You could see them as myths, and they would have the same value to you, unless you are evangelical Zionist who believes in the colonial settler project. That's where the factuality does matter. But to the rest of us, I would challenge anyone to explain why it does matter.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I think for me, first of all, as I understand my faith, it does lay out the parts of the Bible that are historical and the parts that are purely allegorical, and I find that there is a sense of added kind of power to a story to be like, this actually happened, like believing in the
earthly presence of something,
like the historicity of Jesus Christ.
He loves that word, historicity. He can't get enough of it today. He keeps saying historicity all over the place.
Okay, well,
he loves it.
It's the word.
Yeah, but Richard, what kind of power?
So I guess just more like an emotional power to the story, right. That like Christ actually walked and taught and healed. That's a powerful message for me, the validity of that. But in a sense, I do agree with you that if tomorrow I woke up and my faith practice was like, oh no, actually it's an entirely allegorical story, but it has a powerful spiritual message for us throughout, I don't know how much it would change my day-to-day faith practice. And I think that I would find power in it either way. So yeah, I have a stance on it. I think that I do believe in the historical accuracy of biblical accounts, but it's not something that
is a make or break for you.
Yeah, not something I really feel like, if you don't believe this, like you're not understanding it, like you're not gonna get it, kind of place for me. It's kind of like, oh yeah, if you don't think it happened.
The new church has so much text about the power of Jesus coming on earth and dying on the cross, and the whole glorification process is so, I mean, from my layman studies, it looks very important to the spiritual process that happened.
Yeah, so I think maybe the exception to what I'm talking about is the life of Christ. Like, I don't know if
the LOC,
if Moses actually went up on a mountain, or if the sea was actually divided.
Abraham lived for 170 years or whatever. Yeah,
that sort of thing, like, wouldn't necessarily change my day-to-day practice. But yeah, the truthfulness and accuracy of Jesus Christ as God on earth walking through and all that has importance in its validity to me, I'd say.
Cool.
But I guess
you checked one new church box for the day, then, I suppose.
I guess if I die and there is a heaven, but I'm wrong about that, and it was all an allegory, I'll just be like, oh, okay.
Well, still had a pretty nice fulfilled life, I suppose.
I think that once you cross into literalism, you automatically begin to encroach on fundamentalism.
Yeah.
So I would recognize, of course, that there are fundamentalists in all scriptural religions. And the thing that they all have in common, whether Hindu, Muslim, or so on, is accounting for the factuality of their founding myths. So based on that, I would challenge anybody to explain the importance of the factuality of their founding myth without resorting to fundamentalist tropes.
Yeah, I don't believe in the factuality of the founding myths. I don't think that the earth was created in 7 days. I don't think there was actually a big flood. I don't think there was actually a Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
But Jesus Christ is also a founding myth. I mean, in the sense that we're using, in the sense that we're coming to this. I'm not saying that it's mythological and therefore non-historical or ahistorical.
Yeah, yeah.
The Old and New Testament are both part of the same founding prophetic tradition.
So I think fundamentalism struggles because it takes its founding myths, as you were saying, and has to inevitably back a single literal interpretation of every piece of text.
Yeah.
And I think where the new church, as I see it, differs from that is that although it believes that the majority of the biblical accounts are historically accurate, the messages in them regarding our spiritual process and spiritual life are symbolic. And so it is not that the Levitical laws need to all be followed to the letter, but that they are an allegory or a symbolic story telling us about our daily life as spiritual people. And so in that way, it's sort of the biblical literalism does not necessarily lead to fundamental holding to every order and account and law. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Yeah, makes sense what you're saying.
A little bit different. Well, we've been going for a while. I think we should wind down soon. I have one last question I want to ask Aram about his study and an interesting thought I had. And if you have any last ones after that.
I was just talking a bunch. Go for it.
Cool. So I was thinking more about your studies, Aram, into population and diversity and genetics and kind of relating things back. Because I think the one you were talking about, the Jewish, that they are always kind of seen stereotypically as not very diverse, when in reality the populations are very diverse if you take them back. So I was wondering, in just all of these, is that correct? I don't want to quote your study.
Yes. So there is great diversity in contemporary Jewish populations.
Cool.
However, there is also an interesting, what it would appear to be a founder population visible in the Y chromosome. So both of these things have to be accounted for.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that was kind of the establishment for just saying that you've looked into this stuff a whole lot. And so I'm curious if, as you've studied and done research on genetic diversity and how populations have kind of come to be, does that give you any insight into when humans became humans? Like tracing it all back to the kind of dawn of being able to be spiritual and to be self-aware and to actually be Homo sapiens in the same way that we are, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it is. And actually, this is where I think crossing back over to archaeology is important, because genetics can't tell you about a transformation to, humanity, so to speak, because so much of the human genome is shared with non-humans, right? So, but what you can see in the archaeological record is artistic practice, for example. You can, and this is something that is not limited to Homo sapiens, apparently. There is evidence for, somewhat controversial, but I would say fairly well established evidence for Neanderthal art, cave art, that is to say, as well as portable art. But I think maybe the single cultural practice that you really want to focus on is burial of the dead.
Okay.
When did people, in the broadest sense, begin to bury the dead? And the reason that's important is there's plenty of ways to dispose of a body that are more utilitarian than spending energy digging in the ground and depositing the corpse in a fashion of one kind or another, either facing a certain direction or face up or face down. Taking the energy to do that, as opposed to simply dumping the body where it won't smell up your community.
Right.
So when did that happen? And unfortunately, we don't have the answer to that, because unequivocal evidence for deliberate burial of the dead seems to have occurred right around sometime during that Neanderthal, anatomically modern human overlap in Europe and the Near East. So there's some evidence for Neanderthal burial, but it's just not. It's ambiguous.
Right. That's really interesting. Does it have to be a distinct burial, or is it more just death ceremony?
Well, but then, it's a matter of what's left. It's what's left for us in the archaeological record, and the deliberate burial of a body is something that in the archaeological record is really easy to manage, because taphonomic processes, and by taphonomy is the study of how things change and shift over time in the archaeological record. When a body is buried, or at least deposited in a special place, like the back of a cave, things can change, but nonetheless, there are certain patterns that you can divine. So, but unfortunately, a lot of that stuff is still ambiguous. But certainly by the Upper Paleolithic in Europe, 40,000 years ago, there's evidence for deliberate human burials, but
Gotcha.
It's just not that.
Which is, if we link that with the origin of, like you were saying, some sort of spiritual practice, spiritual belief, higher thought, like human consciousness as we know it, it is wild the amount of human history that is missing for us.
Dude, I was literally just thinking the same thing.
Like the amount of human history that we actually have any information about is minuscule compared to our existence then.
Right, it's a fraction.
And especially just looking at how long the Earth has existed and the portion that we are of that. Oh my gosh, talk about minuscule.
Yeah, if 4 billion years is represented as a year, then human history is the last 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Human history is 5 seconds or even less.
Oh, that's nuts.
So anyway, the best thing you can do is, of course, look for things that seem to different things that seem to have changed as a kind of a suite, SUITE, suite of cultural practices, right? So burial of the dead, creation of portable and parietal art, meaning art on the wall of caves that depicts animals, and portable art, meaning idols that somehow implicate that they had a fertility usage. Perhaps even bones with notches that indicate that they were somehow calendric, right?
What does that mean?
So all of the, meaning that they served as some kind of a calendar, right? Or meaning either a lunar cycle, a solar cycle, or somehow a menstrual cycle in the lifetime of whatever animal bone, whatever animal the bone belonged to. I'm grabbing all kinds of things from
really
the archaeological,
Yeah.
And when you see all these things converging, it's the Upper Paleolithic, but that's what it appears to be.
Mm-hmm.
More and more evidence will I predict suggest that some of these things go further back.
Wow. This has been a great talk. I don't want to keep... oh, wait. We did have one last fun question for you. Oh, man, I'm ahead of myself too much. Before we get to our last question, did you have any chance to think back to the one we put on the back burner from the beginning?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, as soon as I said that, I realized that I think I'd already answered the question, and that was...
aliens in sixth dimension?
Yeah, well, I think the most extreme belief I have is probably that human life is going to be non-biological in a matter of centuries.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty extreme belief.
Through
Sorry?
Through computing power, through interface between digital and biological technologies, and I think that the boundary between bio and digital technologies fictitious, that there's a boundary, and that eventually these things will not be thought of as being separate. And eventually life, whatever form it is, will be non-biological.
Yeah, I'm going to have to think about that one. That's an interesting thought for sure. Richard, do you want to hit him with our last little tidbit question? Remember?
Yeah. So final thought, since we're a spiritual podcast, do you have any spiritual ideas that are important to you that you would like to pass on to our audience? Something that you have found useful for you, or something a spiritual belief you'd like more people to know or like to share?
Feel free to take a second.
I would say that the one thing that resonates with me every day comes from Anthony DeMello, who was a Goan Catholic, and he said, "You can't be grateful and unhappy."
I like that.
I like that too. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And thank you for coming on the podcast and taking the time out of your day to share some of your thoughts and expertise with us. We really appreciate it.
Anytime.
Cool, Aram.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Aram
so much.
Yardumian, everyone, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for joining us this week on Spiritable. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to comment on the YouTube video, and we'll make an effort to respond to all of them.
Make sure to smash subscribe, dislike, Spotify, TuneIn, G-Town Radio. Hit us all up. We everywhere.
Stitcher. So
Have a good night. I'm so tired.
I'm exhausted.